It began not in marble halls, but in whispers, in catacombs, behind closed doors, in prayers spoken under threat of death. The city of Rome, in the early years of the 1st century, was a place of greatness and cruelty, a center of empire, draped in triumph and blood. Here, amid the grandeur of palaces and the harsh roar of the Colosseum, a quiet revolution of faith was taking root. Among those who carried this fragile belief was Simon Peter, a fisherman from Galilee, called to follow a man named Jesus. According to tradition, Peter came to Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, a time of darkness for the early Christians. Blamed for a devastating fire that tore through the city, Christians became targets, hunted, arrested, and publicly executed. Peter, by then a leader of the early Christian movement, was among them. It said he was crucified upside down, at his own request, believing himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. His body was buried just outside the city, on the Vatican Hill, a place then covered in gardens and pagan tombs, beyond the ancient walls of Rome. There was no basilica. No gold or statues. Only a simple grave. But from that grave, a spiritual empire would rise. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. Peter's grave on Vatican Hill became a quiet destination for early believers. They came in secret, leaving offerings, lighting candles, whispering prayers in the dead of night. The Roman world above moved on, emperors rose and fell, gods were worshipped and forgotten, but beneath it all, the memory of Peter endured. By the early 4th century, a transformation was underway, one that would forever alter the course of history. Rome, once the persecutor of Christians, now stood on the edge of conversion. In the year 313 AD, Emperor Constantine the Great issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the Roman Empire. And then, in a move both deeply symbolic and politically shrewd, Constantine ordered the construction of a great church. Not just anywhere, but on Vatican Hill, directly above what was believed to be the tomb of St. Peter. The work began slowly. Thousands of workers cleared the sloping hillside. Tombs were moved. Earth was shifted. And at the heart of it all, encased in marble and surrounded by a sacred space, lay the fisherman's remains. This was the birth of Old St. Peter's Basilica, a vast and majestic church unlike any that had come before it. Pilgrims began to arrive from across the empire. They came to kneel in awe, to touch the stone, to feel closer to the man who had walked beside Christ. And in the centuries that followed, this site, Peter's resting place, became not just a shrine, but the center of something far greater. From grave to empire, the Vatican was becoming the beating heart of Christianity. From the humble burial of a fisherman to the construction of a grand basilica, the seed of spiritual authority had been planted. But how did the Bishop of Rome, a local leader among many, become the Pope, the supreme pontiff of a global faith? In the earliest days of Christianity, leadership was scattered. Communities were led by bishops, elders, and deacons. There was no centralized power, no Vatican state, and no golden throne. But Rome held a quiet weight, the capital of the empire, the place where both Peter and Paul had died, and where Peter had served as bishop before his martyrdom. As Christianity grew, and as the Roman Empire began to falter, the church filled a void. Civil structures collapsed, but the church remained. And at its head, the Bishop of Rome grew in stature. It was not a single moment that made the Pope a pope, but rather centuries of slow, steady accumulation of power, influence, and recognition. In the 5th century, Pope Leo I, later called Leo the Great, boldly stepped onto the world stage. When Attila the Hun threatened to sack Rome in 452 AD, it was Leo, not the emperor, who rode out to meet him. The city was spared. Leo also declared something more profound, that Peter, and through him the Pope, held supreme authority in the Church. This idea, Petrine primacy, would become the theological foundation of the papacy. But it was not always a peaceful rise. There were rivals, schisms, and challenges to papal power. The east and west of the Church drifted apart. In 1054, the Great Schism split Christianity into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, a divide that would last nearly 1,000 years. Still, through wars, plagues, and political chaos, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, endured. Clothed in white, crowned in gold, speaking not with the voice of an emperor, but with the authority of Peter. By now, the Vatican was no longer just a place of worship. It was becoming a seat of power, spiritual, political, eternal. By the Middle Ages, the Pope was no longer merely a spiritual shepherd. He was a king among kings. A force that could crown emperors, excommunicate monarchs, and influence the fate of nations. From the 9th to the 13th centuries, the Catholic Church rose to breathtaking heights of influence. With its heart in Rome and its voice carried by the Pope, the Church touched every corner of medieval life, from the peasants in the fields to the lords in their castles. It was not just a religion, it was the framework of civilization. The papacy claimed divine authority passed down through Peter, and in a world plagued by uncertainty, that authority offered both comfort and control. But it came with its own corruption. Some popes were saints. Others were schemers. The line between holiness and ambition often blurred. One moment burned into history was in the year 1077, during the reign of Pope Gregory VII. He clashed with the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, over the power to appoint bishops, a conflict known as the investiture controversy. When Henry was excommunicated, he crossed the Alps in winter, barefoot in the snow, to beg the Pope's forgiveness at Canossa. Power had shifted. The Pope could now humble kings. But such power bred enemies. Crusades were called in the name of God, wars of faith and conquest that swept across Europe and the Middle East. While the Church proclaimed salvation, blood soaked the earth. The Vatican, increasingly wealthy and powerful, became a place of splendor and suspicion. Rome itself was a city of contrasts. Pilgrims knelt in awe within the walls of St. Peter's, while power brokers plotted in shadowed corridors. Papal politics could be ruthless. Families like the Borgias would one day rise, wielding influence and ambition beneath the cross. Still, through war and intrigue, the Vatican remained the spiritual heart of the Christian world. A city within a city. A kingdom within the soul. The medieval world gave way to something dazzling. A rebirth. A revival of art, philosophy, and human potential, and at the very center of it all stood the Vatican. The Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century and flourishing in the 15th and 16th, brought light to a continent once cloaked in shadow. And though it had begun in the cities of Florence and Venice, it soon found its most breathtaking expression in Rome, funded, shaped, and directed by the popes themselves. The Vatican became not just a holy city, but a stage for brilliance. Popes of this era were not only spiritual leaders, they were patrons, scholars, and often, political tacticians. They saw the glory of God reflected in beauty, architecture, and the human mind. Under Pope Nicholas V, the Vatican Library was founded, preserving ancient texts and fueling learning. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, a colossal task that would span over a century. Under his direction, Michelangelo was summoned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a work that still takes the breath of millions. Here, faith met genius. Raphael, Bramante, and Leonardo da Vinci walked the halls. Columns rose, domes soared, and divine stories were painted in vivid color across vaulted ceilings. But with splendor came excess. To finance the grandeur, indulgences, payments for the forgiveness of sins, were sold. This practice, combined with deepening corruption among certain church officials, planted the seeds of rebellion. Still, in the glow of candlelight, the Renaissance Vatican stood like a vision, marble and gold, scripture and science, heaven interpreted through brushstroke and chisel. It was an age of contradiction, divine beauty and human arrogance, worship and wealth. And through it all, the Vatican continued to grow, a spiritual beacon and a political palace. By the early 16th century, the splendor of the Vatican had become impossible to ignore, and so had its flaws. The wealth, the power, the opulence, for many, it had all drifted too far from the teachings of Christ. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg. He wasn't calling for rebellion, not yet. He was calling for reform. But the spark caught fire. Luther's protest against the sale of indulgences, papal corruption, and doctrinal abuses ignited what became the Protestant Reformation, a fracture that would split Christianity in two. Across Europe, people began to question the Pope's authority. New movements arose: Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican. Churches were torn apart, statues smashed, and Latin replaced with local tongues. Kings broke away from Rome. Wars of religion erupted. And at the center of it all, the Vatican stood shaken, but unyielding. In response, the Church launched its own renewal, the Counter-Reformation. Popes convened the Council of Trent, which reaffirmed Catholic doctrine and corrected some of its own abuses. Religious orders like the Jesuits were founded, intellectual, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to Rome. The Vatican became not just a center of tradition, but of revival. Art, once again, was called upon to inspire faith. Caravaggio and Bernini sculpted saints and martyrs in raw, emotional beauty. The Baroque era was born, dramatic, powerful, meant to stir the soul. Yet the battles were not only fought with paint and prayer. They were waged on battlefields. The division of Christianity became permanent. Europe was no longer a single spiritual realm under the Pope, but a continent marked by competing creeds and wounded legacies. Still, the Vatican survived. Its basilica neared completion. Its popes grew more cautious, more refined, but the voice of Peter still echoed. In this time of upheaval, Rome had not fallen. It had adapted, rearmed, and returned, not as a conquering empire, but as a church reforged in fire. For centuries, the popes ruled not just the church, but land. The Papal States, a swath of central Italy, were governed directly by the Vatican for over 1,000 years. Popes had their own armies, minted their own coins, and held court like monarchs. But in the 19th century, the unification of Italy brought that era to a crashing end. By 1870, the Italian army had taken Rome. The Pope's territories were gone. His armies dissolved. The newly unified Italian government declared Rome the capital, not of Christendom, but of a modern, secular Italy. And so, the Pope retreated. For nearly 60 years, he would consider himself a prisoner of the Vatican. Though he still resided in the Apostolic Palace, he refused to step beyond the walls, protesting the seizure of papal lands. This strange standoff endured until 1929, when a historic agreement was signed. It was called the Lateran Treaty, an accord between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy. For the first time in modern history, the Vatican was formally recognized as an independent sovereign state, a city-state, just 44 hectares wide, surrounded entirely by Rome. Thus, Vatican City was born. It was, and still is, the smallest country in the world. It has no airport, no military, and fewer than 1,000 residents. But within its walls stand some of the greatest treasures of human history: the Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican museums, and archives that stretch deep beneath the ground. The Pope became a head of state, as well as a spiritual leader, one who greeted presidents, hosted diplomats, and addressed the world from a marble balcony. And though the Vatican was small, its reach was vast. This city within a city, built on centuries of faith, power, and tradition, now stood as a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. From the ashes of the Papal States, a new chapter had begun, quieter, perhaps, but no less significant. The 20th and 21st centuries brought a tide of transformation. The world was shifting, through war, technology, ideology, and the Vatican, for all its timeless marble and ritual, would not remain untouched. Some popes clung to tradition. Others opened the windows wide. In 1958, a kindly and unexpected figure was elected, Pope John XXIII. Few thought he would leave a lasting mark. Elderly and seen as transitional, he surprised the world by calling for Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. It would be the most significant reform of the Catholic Church in modern times. From 1962 to 1965, bishops and theologians gathered beneath the frescoed ceilings of the Vatican to rethink everything from liturgy to religious freedom. Latin Mass was replaced with local languages. Relations with other faiths were reimagined. The Church looked inward and outward, seeking humility and renewal. John died before the council ended, but his successor, Pope Paul VI, carried it forward. The world watched as the Church, so often the guardian of tradition, took bold steps toward modernity. Then came Pope John Paul II, a towering figure, both literally and spiritually. Elected in 1978, he was the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years, and the first from Eastern Europe. Charismatic, philosophical, and deeply devout, he traveled the world, reaching out to young people, embracing the poor, and challenging the ideologies of the 20th century. He was shot in St. Peter's Square in 1981, and survived. He forgave his attacker. John Paul II played a pivotal role in the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, especially in his native Poland. Under his long papacy, the Vatican reasserted itself not just as a spiritual authority, but as a voice of conscience in global affairs. After his death in 2005, the papacy passed briefly to Pope Benedict XVI, a scholar who emphasized doctrine and tradition. Then, in an unprecedented move, Benedict resigned, the first pope to do so in nearly 600 years. His successor, Pope Francis, became a symbol of a more humble church. The first Jesuit pope. The first from the Americas. He refused to live in the papal palace. He washed the feet of prisoners. he spoke of climate change, economic injustice, and mercy. Each of these popes, in their own way, carried the weight of Peter's legacy. They stood before the world not as emperors, but as men with a message. Fallible, yet faithful. The Vatican changed through them. And yet, beneath it all, the foundation remained, the bones of a fisherman, buried in the hill. Today, the Vatican stands as a remarkable paradox, both ancient and modern, small and immense, spiritual and political. Within its walls, the echoes of 2 millennia reverberate. The marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica are worn by millions of footsteps. The Sistine Chapel's ceiling still gazes down on worshippers and tourists alike. The Vatican Museum's house treasures of art and history beyond measure. Yet beyond the art and the architecture lies a living heart. The Vatican remains the spiritual center for over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. It is the seat of the Pope, a figure who bridges tradition and change, faith and diplomacy. It holds the Holy See, the central governing body of the Catholic Church, which reaches into every continent and culture. It is also a state, recognized by the world's governments, with its own postal system, newspapers, and even a radio station. Its diplomatic corps engages with nations large and small, advocating for peace, human rights, and moral guidance. But the Vatican also wrestles with modern challenges, questions of faith in a secular age, scandals that have shaken its foundations, and the ever-evolving role of religion in a globalized world. Still, it endures. The Vatican is a testament to time, a place where faith, history, power, and art intertwine. A city built on the legacy of a fisherman named Peter, whose shadow still stretches across the centuries. And as night falls on Vatican Hill, beneath the glowing dome of St. Peter's, the candles flicker quietly. The centuries whisper softly. Here is a story of power and humility, of earthly ambition and heavenly hope. A story still unfolding.